think are due is it 8 o'clock? No, 10 o'clock tonight. I can't remember what I set it up, but submit those via Canvas, please. And yeah, we've gone through all of the work from the last week that you all submitted. Some of those definitely need a little bit more thought on some parts. Everybody got complete, so that's fine. But I marked things on those. So if you were part of a group and you were not the one who submitted it, then you probably want to talk to the person who submitted it and make sure you can see those comments at some point. They should be able to just print a PDF, which has all the comments on the side. There are just a couple of areas that I wanted folks to make sure to focus on, like the role of the state board and 404 permitting, the 401 certifications, because that's where the whole state veto is. So that's kind of an important part of those things, just as a for example. And I'll do the same thing with these. I'll comment on any areas that I think you might want to look at a little bit more closely. And then generally on the final, I try and pull at least one question from these worksheets that we've done. So you should have some idea that it's coming, and we'll give you a chance to look through your worksheets and know one of the questions you'll get on the final. So hopefully that incentivizes good attention to these things, in spite of the fact that you're not going to grade it on them more broadly. All right, so public trust. I have to stay over here now, don't I? Yep. Okay, so public trust doctrine. It's really throwing me off. I mean, it's TV on the wrong side. But we're going to roll with it. It's going to be okay. So this is super ancient doctrine. You can go all the way back to the Institutes of Justinian, ancient Roman law. By the law of nature, these things are common to mankind: the air, running water, the sea, and consequently the shores of the sea. The air part of this is interesting. We really haven't seen that play out in the U.S. yet, but certainly the other ones are in play now. This kind of continues through England. You look at English law, and you've got the king holding land in title for the people. So tidelands, navigable rivers was the extent of that traditional public trust doctrine. And the same theory came into U.S. law when the U.S. Was created. At first, we didn't really see it show up. The first time we really see it asserted in a big way is that Illinois Railroad case that you all have been discussing. So there are kind of four principles you can think about that underpin this idea of a public trust doctrine. There's certain things that the earth has that we all need that should not be sequestered for private use. They should be publicly available. These resources must be kept public. These resources must be stewarded sustainably by those in power. And last, the public has the right to demand its trust resources are stewarded sustainably. So there's an element of public accountability for whoever is in control of this trust. So if you've had like wills and trusts and estates, any of those classes yet, maybe you've talked about trusts. Generally, the idea of a trust is you have a trustee who is in charge of some property that does not belong to the trustee, but which the trustee is managing for the benefit of somebody else. Right? Like I've got a life insurance policy. If my wife and I die, then it goes into a trust for my kids. And there would be a trustee appointed by whoever was executing my estate. This is stuff I guess I should really have ironed out, but we haven't worried about it yet.
You should do it before you kayak on Friday.
Yes, when we die, it would be good. I don't have to worry about my contract anymore. So yeah, I had that moment actually on the Grand Canyon where I was like, this is it, I'm going to die. At least I'm well insured. And there's a measure of reassurance there. That was great, yeah. I can go quietly into the night. Anyway, the point is, if I die, then that money goes into a trust. Trustee holds that trust and then uses that trust to take care of my kids, right? Same idea here. We have a public trust. So we all are beneficiaries of this trust. The state, in our case, is the sovereign entity that is the trustee for us. In ancient Roman law, it would have been the Roman emperor. England, you've got the king. So whatever the sovereign is, and in the U.S., this is the state that's the sovereign. It's not the federal government. So the state takes over for the king or for whoever held that property, the state's property, before that state became a state. So there is not, right now, a federal public trust doctrine that has gotten any teeth anywhere. That might change in the future. Maybe federal public land should be measured or managed based on the federal public trust doctrine, but we don't have one right now. We just have state public trusts. So the state is the trustee holding this property for the benefit of the people. As I said, U.S. rebirth comes in Illinois Central Railroad. This is the first big U.S. public trust case. We've talked about what a trust is. Two big things to take out of this is that the public trust is back. It is at play in the United States, and it's certainly at play in a traditional form in the United States. So no kind of modern spin on it like we start seeing in some of those California cases. So very traditional form, the public trust doctrine, and it does restrict the legislature's ability to sell lands. That's kind of the narrower holding. You can give up small parcels for improvement. You can grant parcels if this can be done without impairing the public trust, but the state can't apparently wholesale sell off these trust lands and make them private and exclude the public from using those lands. Interesting part of this, and maybe what gave birth to the public trust here, is that there's a strong suggestion that Illinois is a pretty corrupt place, and I think that was true for an awful long time after this decision, but there's some suggestion that the Illinois Central Railroad got the rights to this property through bribing the legislature that sold it to them, and a new legislature, a cleaner legislature came in, or at least a legislature that they hadn't paid enough bribes to, and so wanted to roll back this kind of dirty dealing, and the Supreme Court then found a way for that to happen. But regardless of the specific facts here, the Supreme Court breathes life back into the public trust doctrine. And this is a public trust. One of the really interesting things here is that the state can't give this up. The state can't get rid of or choose not to use this responsibility. The state can no more abdicate its trust over property in which the whole people are interested, like navigable waters and the soil under them, than it can abdicate its police powers in the administration of government. The state has a responsibility here that it cannot avoid. It can't get rid of. All right, so just to really pin down this traditional public trust doctrine, this covers really just three interests: commerce, navigation, and fisheries. So floating logs downstream, for example, moving boats, barges around, and people going out and using fish resources. Only covers navigable waterways and tidelands, and this at least exists in some form in almost every state. Some states really crack down on this idea of navigable waterways. They have a very narrow definition of what navigable is. In Kansas, there are 3 rivers that are considered navigable. It's based on whether they were used commercially when the state joined the Union. I think Colorado has 1 river that's been determined to be navigable. The Colorado River in kind of the corner of the state is navigable. If you've been to Colorado, people are navigating all over rivers all over the state, right? You have people floating down these things all the time. But that's not the definition that the Colorado Supreme Court has used in its public trust cases. So a ton of variation about what navigable is. Yeah?
Isn't it true too that parts of a river can be considered like a segment as navigable versus
Right.
not within a state though?
Yeah, within a single, so the Colorado River flows through a big chunk of Colorado, and it's only this very bottom section where it's considered navigable. I mean, any river, if you get down far enough, it becomes a tideline, right? And then it's definitely navigable there. But yeah, good question. And so again, this exists in some form in most states. Some states have embraced a very different form of the public trust doctrine. And that form initially came out of an article by Joe Sachs, Michigan law professor, who wrote this great article in 1970, The Public Trust Doctrine and Natural Resources Law, Effective Judicial Intervention. This is something that law professors like to tout because it's one of these few examples where like a law review article actually made a difference. So kind of a huge deal. Before this, there was no modern public trust doctrine. And if you read that Marks v. Whitney case, this thing gets cited all the time in there. Marks v. Whitney essentially adopts wholesale a lot of the arguments that Joe Sachs makes in this article. Joe Sachs is also the guy who essentially imported the whole idea of citizen suits into environmental law. They came out of civil rights law originally, and he brought them over into environmental law as a way to encourage environmental litigation. So big figure who's in modern environmental law. So Marks v. Whitney, this is a map of the beach. It's actually at play here. Camino del Mar right here, Via de la Vista Road here, all these big expensive houses. This one you can actually rent on Airbnb, and it's owned by the grandchild of one of the guys who was involved in this case initially. So kind of a cool deal. We emailed, we had a moment. It was great. This is called Chicken Ranch Beach. So the beach here that's at issue is Chicken Ranch Beach. And that gives you an idea right where it is in Tomales Bay, a very grainy picture. So this is the setup, right? We've got Whitney's land up here. Marks has the land down here that keeps Whitney from accessing via his pier the whole Tomales Bay area. And really, it's like talking to Whitney's grandson. Apparently, Marks kept putting a fence up here that would keep the rest of the people who live there from coming down and using this beach. So even though it's ostensibly about Whitney's personal rights, Whitney brought this lawsuit because the community really uses Chicken Ranch Beach a lot and wanted to keep using Chicken Ranch Beach. It's a terrible name for a beach. Let's go with the Chicken Ranch. All right, so there's Whitney's parcel. This is the high water line right here, right on the edge of his parcel. So that'd be the low water line, and this whole thing is Mark's parcel here. Mark's is was a real estate developer in the area, who I think eventually sold almost all of his land off and got out of there. So this goes to the trial court, 1971. Trial court says Whitney has no standing to raise public trust arguments here. Refused to make a finding as to whether the tidelands were subject to the public trust doctrine because there's not a party there to even raise that claim. This is not unusual. If you go back to we've talked a little bit about Friant Dam on the San Joaquin River. It's the dam that dried up like 60 miles of that river. A bunch of downstream landowners tried to file a lawsuit saying that you can't just drive the river there, you're going to kill off all the salmon. And the court in that case, just like here, said, hey, you don't have standing to make this argument. If anybody's going to protect this public resource, it's got to be the state that does it. And of course, the state was the one that was pushing for the dam, or at least in part pushing for the dam. And so they weren't going to come in and say you can't do that. So it goes to the appellate court. And the appellate court says defendant Whitney does not own the public rights and can neither express nor control them. So same deal, right? This is the public trust. The public has to go through its government in order to protect the public trust. Inherently, that's a bit of a problem if you're concerned about whether the state's protecting your trust or not. But this was what all of the precedent said. There was no kind of suggestion before this case that there was any public right or private right of any of us to step in and enforce the public trust doctrine. And then it goes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says, no, actually there is standing here for a private individual. We are all beneficiaries of the public trust, and so we can file suit in order to protect that trust interest. It's a huge change. It means empowers essentially all of us as private attorneys general to sue individuals like Marks who were seeking to impair the public trust, and to sue state agencies if state agencies aren't adequately protecting the public trust. So giant expansion in who can file suit here, and this is one of those examples where if you want these things to be enforced, you have to find a way to enforce them, and if the state won't do it, giving rights to the public to do that breeds a much higher level of enforcement. So changes after Marks v. Whitney, this was about a traditional public trust area, right? So we're not seeing a big expansion in the geographic scope of the public trust. It still just covers these tidelands, navigable waterways. Private party standing, big change, right? All of a sudden, anybody can sue to do this. And then there's a big change in the scope of the trust. Remember, the old trust protected commerce, navigation, fisheries. That's it, okay? Marks v. Whitney says, hey, this is the traditional stuff, navigation, commerce, and fisheries, right to fish, hunt, bathe, swim, use for boating, general recreation purposes, that's it. But public needs are changing, and that means the public trust has to change to reflect those new needs. So new needs can include serving as ecological units for scientific study, open space, environments which provide food and habitat for birds and marine life, environments which favorably affect the scenery and climate of an area, and maybe more. We don't have to define everything. That's a big change from navigation, commerce, and fisheries. So we get a big expansion in who can enforce the public trust, a big expansion in what the public trust protects, but no change in kind of what geographically the trust is actually covering. All right, questions on Marks v. Whitney? Everybody good there? Okay, so then we go into National Audubon Society v. the Superior Court. How much time do we have left? If we have time, we'll come back and watch the video on Mono Lake. We'll see. Okay, let's show the video. Well, worst case, then I don't have to talk as much about CERCLA and RCRA next week, which To be honest, no one really cares about them. No. Apparently people care about them, just not me.
Mono Lake was born 750,000 years ago when its tectonic basin was formed by faulting and downwarping of the Earth's crust. The lunar landscape and natural spires of the oldest lake in America have become the stage for one of environmental activism's greatest success stories. Its recent restoration is here to show the world that through collaborative efforts, intelligent planning, and efficient implementation, we can continue to move forward as a society without jeopardizing the delicate balance of nature.
The Mono Lake story starts back in the 1940s. In 1941, Los Angeles began diverting water from the tributary streams to Mono Lake here in the Mono Basin, putting them into an aqueduct system and transporting them 350 miles to the south and delivering that water to the city for a water supply for the residents of Los Angeles. When David Gaines and a group of fellow scientists showed up in 1976 and conducted an ecological study of the Mono Basin, they were shocked to find a number of very large impacts. Because the lake was going down, it was getting saltier. And as it got saltier, it was undermining the food chain that supports millions of migratory birds that come to Mono Lake. 85% of the state's nesting California gulls come here in the summer, raise their young before going back to the coast in the winter. So they realized that if the lake got too salty, a bunch of banana flies would be gone and we would not be able to support these bird populations, really leading to a full ecological collapse of the lake. At the same time, they found that dust storms were being treated on the exposed lake bed, contained toxic minerals, hazardous to human health. So a huge set of problems all coming together that was identified in 1976. David Gaines started the Mono Lake Committee in 1978, and the goal was always to find a solution that allowed LA some water, recognizing LA has real water needs, but to do that in a way that protects Mono Lake. And by the 1980s, there was a lot of support for protecting Mono Lake. California didn't want to have Mono Lake collapse as an ecosystem. We didn't want to have a toxic dust bowl here in the Mono Basin. And so that led to a very prolonged court fight about what was legal and what was possible. There were a number of important victories along the way. It's a huge California Supreme Court decision that came down and said there was a mistake when Los Angeles was allowed to divert this much water. It's too much. It's damaging the public trust. We need to go back and relook at this water rights decision. LA has a claim to some water, but clearly it can't be this much. It has to be something less, and we need to figure out what that is. We worked with the state government to get a state park created at Mono Lake that would at least protect and manage the lake itself and the shoreline lands. We worked with the federal government to get a Forest Service scenic area that would protect the surrounding Mono Basin lands. It all led to a water rights decision that actually revoked LA's right to take water from the Mono Basin, from these streams, and then reissued it, but with new conditions. And the new conditions require that Mono Lake be maintained at an ecologically sound level. Quite a bit of work went into identifying what that level is. Surface elevation, 6,392 feet above sea level. When we won the water rights decision that changed how much water LA could take from Mono Lake, we initiated efforts to try to get Los Angeles to change its management of the aqueduct system. Don't go take it from some other natural resource. Let's look at water conservation, water recycling, and local water use solutions that could offset the diversions from the Mono Basin. And then we were able to work with the state legislature and identify some money that could be provided to Los Angeles to fund water reclamation programs. It's about $40 million, and that money was available to LA. It could be used to build water reclamation facilities that would provide new water for Los Angeles. Ultimately, by the 1990s, we were able to actually get that program implemented and reach a project of agreement that is in fact offsetting diversions from the Mono Basin and helping LA meet its real water needs in the city and Mono Lake recover at the same time. One example is the ultra low flush toilet program that Los Angeles has done, saving more water annually through toilet replacement than was ever diverted from Mono Lake on an annual basis. Landscaping, using native plants, drought-tolerant plants, stormwater capture are all part of that effort. Los Angeles has a huge potential with water recycling or water reclamation, where they're treating wastewater in the city so that it can be reused. That reuse would be for irrigation, golf courses, freeway plantings, parks that don't need to have fresh snowmelt water. The reuse of that water offsets a great demand for imported water. That's part of the success story of Mono Lake. LA used to be famous as a water wasting city. The reality is much different now, and the city is really at the forefront as a leader of water conservation in California and in the West. They're able now in Los Angeles to supply 1 million more residents than they had 30 years ago with the same amount of water. It's a tremendous conservation success that really shows the connection between the urban environment and the natural environment, between the cities and the rural areas in the state, and how what happens in the city matters to what happens up here. We are seeing some really promising signs on the ground. The lake is rising toward its long-term management level, and we're seeing some great recovery and improvement of habitat. But you have to stay vigilant, you have to make sure those programs stay in place. Commonly discussed in the environmental world are the 3 R's, reduce, reuse, and recycle. And in terms of water, I think Mono Lake really showed that this is not only possible, but that it's the successful path to a sustainable future. It's one of the few water stories and few environmental stories, I think, where we've actually reached a very good solution, and we're now in the implementation phase to really make it into a reality on the ground.
All right. There you go. Video. Yes. So not to put too fine a point on it, Mono Lake is a salt lake. You can't drink the water that's in the lake, right? It's a terminal basin, no streams flow out, water flows in, it evaporates, it just gets saltier and saltier over time. There are no fish. You can't fish in Mono Lake. There are brine shrimp. Some people catch those in nets to sell as fish food, or anybody have sea monkeys growing up? Yeah, they're the sea monkeys, right? So there's sea monkeys there. There's brine flies, which are just really annoying, buzzy little flies, except birds eat them, so they're important ecologically. But in the end, what we have here is a salt lake, and what the plaintiffs are seeking here is to take water away from LA that LA is using as drinking water and to send that back into a salt lake. Right, so that's a pretty, it's hard to imagine a more, a cleaner showing of what public trust doctrine can mean in California. We're taking water away from these, admittedly in some cases, profligate uses in LA and putting it back into a natural system so the natural system can be a healthy, intact natural system. And that's a pretty remarkable thing to do. It's a pretty remarkable level of, a pretty remarkable degree to which people are willing to leave this stuff in place. So I think it is a great story, and certainly a pretty fascinating success story. Skip over this stuff. So big questions here. The diversions weren't from the lake itself. Again, it's a salt lake. You can't pull salt water up and send it to LA. They've got plenty of that down there in the ocean. So they're pulling water out of the streams that flow down into the lake. These streams are small. You saw the video. These are not large lakes. The question is, are those streams themselves subject to the public trust doctrine? Right, they're not navigable waterways, so they don't fall within the traditional view. And so the first question was, does this even cover these? And looking at this, the court says, yes, public trust doctrine is recognized and developed in California decisions, protects navigable waters, in this case the lake, from harm caused by the diversion of non-navigable tributaries. And they went for this decision back to some of the really old nuisance cases dealing with hydraulic mining, saying, hey, in that case we were protecting downstream folks from all the mine waste that came out of these really small mined streams. those areas that were being mined weren't navigable, but what was going on there was affecting people downstream on navigable waterways. So based on that case law, yeah, public trust covers these streams. So that's a big expansion in the geographic scope now of the public trust doctrine, right? So now we've got standing has been expanded, protection has been expanded, and the geographic scope of the trust doctrine has been expanded under this modern public trust doctrine. So the second part of this case then is how do we take all of these water law cases, and this kind of broad history that you got from Professor Harder on water law, which has all been about like maximizing use of water, making sure we're not wasting water by sending it out to the ocean, getting water into people's hands so they can farm with it, drink it, whatever, put it to productive use. How do we mesh that with this public trust doctrine that values in-stream uses of water, protecting these ecological values, these natural interests? Definitely kind of after Marks v. Whitney, it's clear that this case is coming. There's not a way really clearly to fit these things together. And so that's the responsibility the court has here. And the first thing the court makes absolutely clear is that public trust does not go away. The state's the administrator of the trust, and it can't not protect that. So any grantee, anybody who has a water right in the state, holds that right subject to the trust, and while he may assert a vested right to the servient estate, meaning servient to this trust, he can claim no vested right to bar recognition of the trust or state action to carry out its purposes. So you have this right, but this right has, and apparently has always had, the court tells us, this public trust kind of prior claim on your water. And so the way you use that water can't kind of overly or can't impact the public trust too much. That degree of that, I think, is something that's a little bit up in the air. On the other hand, the state has to have the ability to give water rights in order to develop water in the state, to have places like LA that bring their water in from a long way away. The state must have the power to give rights to appropriate water, even if that diversion is going to harm the public trust. And certainly LA taking any water out is going to impact it in some ways. So what the court said is before state courts and agencies approve water diversions, they should consider the effect of such diversions upon interests protected by the public trust and attempt, so far as feasible, to avoid or minimize any harm to those interests. So feasibility appears to be the standard. It's not super clear what that means. There's a lot of case law about protecting the public trust, but there's not a lot of case law about pinning down exactly what that looks like in any given situation. But we know from this that the state must consider the public trust and has an ongoing permanent responsibility to continue considering the public trust when issuing and letting people use these water rights. Everybody good with that? All right. So after National Audubon, our trust we know covers tidelands, navigable lakes and streams, and non-navigable waterways as needed to protect those other waters, values, the traditional values, recreation, ecological values. Timing is perpetual and ongoing, and standing is very broad. All right. All good with that? So next thing, this is a really interesting case that was decided in 2015. Environmental Law Foundation versus the State Water Resources Control Board. This is on the Scott River. And what we're looking at on this river is, we've got a river kind of like this in cross section. Here's our river. And then our groundwater is on either side of this river. So this is all groundwater here. And this is in a gaining reach, meaning the water is flowing from the groundwater into this river to keep this river flowing during the summer. That's the only reason this river has water, is water from the ground coming out into the river. Everybody good with that? Lots of cobble in here, lots of rock, bigger sand, so the water can move fairly easily between these sides. So then we've got a pump here, spinny thing, whatever. Pipe drops down, they're pumping water here, and as they pump that water, we form what's called a cone of depression, just like in your milkshake around it, where it sucks that groundwater down, the groundwater level drops, right? So the water table drops in this area. And that means instead of water going in, we've got water coming out of the river into the groundwater here. So we're actually losing water out of this river. And this is a navigable river. And so the question was, is this groundwater pumping covered by public trust doctrine or not? And this district court looks at this and says, the public trust doctrine protects navigable waterways from any harm covered by groundwater extraction, which means that when you decide to let people pump this groundwater, you have to consider the public trust when you're making that decision. It's only one district court decision. Nobody really wanted to appeal it up or anything because they don't want to get overturned. Both sides didn't. One side didn't want it to be overturned. The other side didn't want it to become permanent, broadly applied case law. So it hasn't really gone anywhere since then. But this is definitely an area to watch in the future. Yeah.
In LA, isn't that a big problem with the pumping affecting ocean and other surrounding waters?
It is. So down there, they've actually, they've got these rivers that are flowing. This is a side view. Rivers flowing downstream. They'll put in little check dams, and then they're not taking water from directly behind these check dams, but they're taking water from off on the hillside over here. But they're using these check dams to increase the flow of groundwater out of the river into the groundwater. And so when they pull it out here, there's way less water coming out below the dam than there would be historically. So yeah, I think that's probably an area where we'll see some additional litigation on this one. Great, other questions? Okay, I think where I want to leave you, since I have like 1 minute left on my clock, is a question of where this comes from. Where does this doctrine come from? What are our sources of law generally? Like, where do we find law? Yeah.
Constitution.
Good. Constitution, supreme law of the land, state constitutions. All right. Other sources? Common law. Okay. What are the characteristics of common law?
The prior decisions that are what we base our law on.
Good. And what if the legislature wants to change common law? How do they do that?
They have to expressly do the statute.
Yeah, so we pass a law and they can change it. Okay, so we've got common law, we've got constitution. We just talked about making state or federal law legislatively. Other sources of law? Administrative law, that's like 3/4 of this class, right? Admin law. So what kind of law is the public trust doctrine? And that is where we'll pick back up on Monday. I know you won't be able to sleep all weekend, but email me if it's stressing you out and I will tell you there is no answer.
2 in the morning.
There is no spoon. I would prefer that question not be asked. I would say take the RSVP off and we'll just see what happens. That's good.